Welcome to Two Teachers and a Table. We are your hosts. This is Mr. Bergman, and I am Mr. Ripka. Today, we would like to discuss an author, Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal was born in 1623, and he died in 1662. This means, of course, he died when he was a young man of 39 years. During his 39 years of living, he became famous as a French philosopher, mostly as a mathematician, though, a scientist, an inventor, and a theologian, especially in the later parts of his years. He made historic contributions to math even at 16 years old. He had quite a bit of wonderful things he contributed to math. Some of us may remember, of course, from high school math, Pascal's triangle. In philosophy, he opposed Descartes' rationalism. He was a contemporary of Descartes. He was a pioneer of existentialism, which is curious, being that he's also a staunch defender of Christianity. Yet he did oppose the theology of the Middle Ages. And lastly, he is the inventor of the early calculator. What a CV he had indeed. What we would like to do is focus today on his book, Pensées, meaning thoughts, and we are going to ask essentially the general question for today is, according to Pascal, what is the nature of a human being? But we're going to ask this under the umbrella of a question that he provides here. He provides us with this thing called Pascal's wager. It's come to be known as Pascal's wager. And so I'd like to ask Mr. Bergman first, of course, what exactly is Pascal's wager?
Well, first of all, considering Blaise Pascal, he made a tremendous academic contribution to the age of Enlightenment. He's a true child of the Enlightenment, completely steeped in the new ideas of the time. One thing, though, that Pascal realized is that a lot of Enlightenment thinkers were turning toward atheism, and he himself still had a religious consciousness that he did not want to abandon, and that he felt that religion to some degree, and just even in the deist form, not necessarily Christian, but in the deist form, that there was some kind of salvation or eternal life.
Could I interject for a second? I have two questions. One is, what is deism, just so that we can get
Deism
that
is just a general belief in a creator that has created the world and provided, or created the universe and provided what we call the inalienable rights to all of us.
Am I wrong? Is that the idea where some creator creates the world and then steps back and lets it run on itself?
Just like a clock.
Like a clock.
Right, just lets it run. Like he wound up the clock and now the clock is running.
I see.
Exactly. And it's not a belief of the book. There's not a Bible tradition or a ritual tradition or church or a historic tradition. It's simply a belief that God exists. I guess today you would call them universalists. Or Unitarians. As well.
My second question was, what was happening during the Enlightenment that led to atheism?
Well, people just started to believe, first of all, there was a feeling of animosity toward the old regime. The ancien regime, as the French say, was represented not only by the king, but by the church authority, and in them rebelling against the church. Some of them felt that science disproved what the church had taught. They were looking, even historically, they said the Bible, it doesn't, scientifically, the Bible's not accurate. Historically, it's not accurate, so they immediately banned. They saw no reconciliation between the two.
I see. Thanks for answering those. I hope I didn't derail you too much. If we can come back to what exactly was the wager, that'd be...
Yeah, well, the wager is really important, first of all, to realize, too, why Pascal, a little bit more about that history of what was going on at the time. Pascal was influenced by some of the theories of Jansenism, and Jansenism actually was developed by a priest in the Netherlands who was actually working Calvinist theory into Catholicism.
Nice.
And part of that involved predestination.
That's what Calvinists, right? Calvinist theory does have predestination.
Exactly, predestination. And I really believe that predestination is very concerned with salvation. And I think that Pascal, being influenced by Jansenism, and he wrote extensively about the religious aspects or the theological aspects that came out of Jansenism.
Yeah, I think he wrote the Provençal letters or something like
Yes,
that, which
yes.
have to do with that. And then even this is an apology. It ends up, he wanted it to be an apology, the Pensée, for Christianity, but he died before it could be published. And
Right.
so it's published in these aphoristic
And,
statements.
right, and it's in that format, that we even have from St. Augustine. And St. Augustine is also highly influenced the Jansenists, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
But so Pascal, in his concern for salvation or making the idea of God compatible with the science that was going on at the time, came up mostly with a 2-to-1 theory. The theory was whether or not God exists and how what you believe. So therefore, if God exists and we believe in Him, then we are well off. We can be saved. If God doesn't exist and we believe in Him, we've got nothing to lose. If God
because you're going to die anyway.
Right, exactly.
And I think if I remember right, and you end up living a sort of virtuous life the whole
exactly,
time.
which is what predestination demands of you anyway, because by living a virtuous life, you're proving to yourself that you're saved. And exactly. And finally, though, if there is a God and you don't believe, then you're condemned. So your odds of believing your odds of salvation are better if you believe.
So the wager is a betting game.
Right, exactly.
If you're a betting person, then the wager is your sort of bet on God, and you have a 2/3 chance of winning.
Exactly. It's like the 3 shells with the pea underneath.
And 2 of them have God in them, or something in a way.
Exactly.
And why would you not bet on those 2? That your chances would then be 2/3.
Right. So
Or
it's best to believe.
66% or something like this.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
So and it works him well with the religious background that he maintained in a France that was struggling with clerical.
I see. So people are already starting to question the church, question God's existence, question the institutions, all these sort of definitely institutions, right? And they started to focus more on reason, logic, things of this nature. Is that right? During the Enlightenment,
Right.
And this is a sort of a logical bet in a way. It uses your reason to
Exactly.
bet, as opposed to having faith in God, where you just believe in God with no rational sort of proof. I think, am I wrong? He's saying you don't need proof. It's a bet.
Yeah, exactly.
There need to be no proof for God. It's a bet. If you're a betting person or if you're just rational, you'll see that it's a good bet.
Right, and statistically speaking, it works out mathematically as well.
Yeah.
Which
Which is funny because you normally think of it as a 50-50. 50-50 bet. God exists, God doesn't exist. Put your bets on the table. But he offered one more, essentially,
Right.
and made the bet way more for believing. Than not believing.
Right.
Is this, I'm curious, is this, and I don't even know if this question is answerable, really, but is this wager only for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob?
And no, because deism is just for whatever God that is, and that God doesn't have to follow any type of book or tradition.
What would you say if somebody said, I believe in Zeus? Is this a bet for the belief in Zeus, you think?
Well, one does have to consider, though, if you're talking about Zeus, the ancient Greeks didn't believe in an afterlife like
we do.
Yeah, or even like Buddhists.
That's a good
when it comes to the
point.
transcending, or
Yeah.
however you get into a better state. In ancient Greece, everybody went to the same place, and it wasn't pleasant.
It wasn't, yeah.
The underworld was, a place of ghosts.
In the Odyssey, when Odysseus does go into the underworld, he meets Achilles, who's already dead and under there, and Achilles even says, or Odysseus says to him, "Wow, it's kind of nice. You're like a king down here or something." And Achilles' response is something like, "I'd rather be a peasant up there than a king down here, right? And so I mean, to prove your point that it's not a pleasant place. Which is also interesting because in Paradise Lost, Satan says the exact opposite, right? Satan says, "I'd rather be a king down here than a servant up in heaven." So this is a wager, not for the ancients really, because it's a whole different afterlife.
Right.
We're
Well,
talking
once again,
about.
it can't be a god technically with a tradition or a history, a church. It has to be just I believe that there is a creator, and I believe that I'll end up in a better place, or being rewarded for the virtuous life I lived on, or simply by the fact that God represents the good in all of us. So you may want to take it to that point.
I see. What? I guess I'm curious now on the original question, since we now know what the wager kind of is. I want to ask, what is he assuming about human nature? If you have any thoughts on that, in order that he could create such a wager for humans, are there certain assumptions such as like humans are charitable or selfish or rational or practical or whatever? What is he assuming? Do you think about humans that they would be willing to even put their money on the table for such a bet?
Sorry. Well, one thing, I mean, some of the ideas of the Enlightenment, especially those that turn political, sort of aimed at the fact that in order for anything to work, for government to work, or for people to have any kind of sense of freedom, man had to be naturally good. You can probably...
So he thinks man is naturally
good.
good.
Right. And I mean, he didn't
You mean
emphasize
good?
it like Locke would emphasize it, but... and Hobbes would say just the opposite.
Well, brutish, right? Man is naturally brutish.
People will do their own thing.
Yeah. What about he's against Descartes, as we've talked about on the start of the show, and Descartes, of course, had all this great education, much like Pascal did, and he, in reflection, thought, you know what? There's so many opinions of the past that conflict with each other that I'm giving all the past up and I'm starting over, right? And this is, of course, his meditations. He expresses this thought in his meditations. And then he, of course, says, I'm going to believe in nothing now. I'm going to start from scratch and just build up. And he reaches he kind of becomes depressed, one would say, until he reaches the foundation, and he has that famous, I think, therefore I am, the cogito ergo sum. And he says, okay, I can believe that. As long as I'm doubting, I know I'm doubting, therefore I exist, right? And so I'm thinking, I'm using my mind to doubt. I have to exist if I can doubt. After that, he goes, well, he goes inward, right, to start believing things, and then he says, well, I have an idea of perfection in me somehow. Well, that had to have been implanted by some perfect being, and therefore that has to be God. That's true, right? You follow, you agree with my assessment of Descartes so far?
Yeah, that's absolutely.
Okay, so I guess what I'm trying to say is Descartes goes inward and tries to use reason to prove God's existence. Pascal, on the other hand, are you suggesting, says, no, we can't do that. There is no rational proof for God.
Well, I don't see him taking an active stance with it one way or the other. I think he's throwing the wager out there to be as fair as he can, because it's more open to interpretation than an actual theology lesson.
It's not a rational proof
Right.
of God's existence, like Anselm or Descartes or the other folks who have come before who try to give rational proofs. This is a pure, you have to have faith in God,
Yes.
but for those, I think it was, if I'm hearing you correctly, for those that don't have faith, blind faith or whatever kind of faith you have in God, then here's a betting game for you, and use your mind to figure out where you would place your bet.
Exactly. But I wanted to ask you too,
Sure.
while we're thinking about this. I was reading about that there was a 2-day meeting between Descartes and Blaise Pascal.
Really?
Yeah, they actually they intended to spend a longer time together, but apparently only lasted 2 days. Where they just basically you had Blaise Pascal discussing some of his scientific theories, etc. I was just wondering if you know anything about that, or how, when we talk about the fact that one of these, I assume Descartes was more of an influence on Pascal, based on what was said than the other way around.
From my readings, I don't remember Descartes ever even bringing up Pascal's name in his books, right? Like in the Meditations, the Discourse on Method, any of his works. I don't really remember him bringing up Pascal. Pascal brings up Descartes quite extensively in his Pensées. It seems like Descartes has had more influence on Pascal than Pascal has had on Descartes. But I imagine if they had this 2-day meeting that, they both were thinking of what each other was doing,
Right.
and it sounds like they weren't just opposed in sort of their thinking about God and stuff, but they had some sort of like personality conflict or something.
That's exactly what I found when I read about what Descartes said about the 2-day meeting in particular, and I just get the idea that he felt that Pascal was imaginative, naive.
Yeah.
Just fanciful.
It reminds me, you bring up a good point, because Pascal does say that the imagination has much more influence and effect on humans than rationality and reason. And he says, just take your philosopher, your rational philosopher who has reasoned everything out, and put him on a little plank and tell him it's a safe plank, but the plank goes over an abyss. Right, and he has to walk on that plank. That you tell him rationally that plank is sturdy and it's fine. You just walk across it, and he goes, even your most rational philosopher will become anxious on that plank. And why? Because the imagination starts taking over the reason. So I do think that you're right in that Pascal has claims there's much more of an influence on humans through the imagination than through reason.
Right.
That is, you can rationally tell somebody to believe in God, and they may not follow along, or they may not believe you. But if you can get to their imagination, if you can get to their imagination through stories or something like this, then they may believe in that. He even goes as far as claiming that this is why a lot of religious figures have these flamboyant outfits. It is to trigger the imagination of the audience. It is to give this sort of image of royalty, this image of power, and that it affects the imagination. So I do think that. Also, the Bible story that I remember, I think it was David. Maybe you can remind me of the story a little bit more. But there was David, and then he saw the woman bathing. You remember that story where David saw the woman bathing, and he sends her husband to war, so that he would die, puts him up into the front line because he wants to be with his wife. I don't remember her name exactly. But one of David's followers comes up and says, hey man, you shouldn't be doing that, that's wrong. And he's like, I'm king, don't tell me what to do, or something of this nature. And however, somebody else comes up and says, let me tell you a story. And so instead of just telling him he's wrong and why, the guy tells him a story about this king who kind of does the same thing, and it stirs David up. He goes, what? Where is that guy? Let's take him down. That's wrong. And then it dawns on him, wait, that's what I did. So, of course, this is the Hamlet scene, too, in Hamlet, right, where Claudius sees the play, right,
and realizes he's one of the characters.
And then what does he do right after the play is he bends down on his knees and prays to God for forgiveness, but, of course, he wasn't sincere in his praying for forgiveness. I think all that I'm trying to say is that Pascal, that's the idea, that the imagination has much more influence on humans, in my understanding, according to Pascal, than rationality or reason does.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what I get the idea, too, that as a result, Pascal tended to be more optimistic than Descartes.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, Descartes even ridicules Pascal. Pascal is talking about the scientific creation of a vacuum, and Descartes disagreed with the theory and said that when writing about Pascal, says he had a vacuum in his head, and the idea that it's he'll just rattle off anything because he's so imaginative and creative. I just get the idea that and Pascal was apparently younger. As well, which had something to do with that. And I have a feeling, too, because Pascal He didn't have a family, of his own, children or wife or anything, and he sort of stayed a student, and didn't quite have the worldly maturity
I could see
that
that.
Descartes
Yeah.
had.
It kind of reminds me of one of his pensées in here, which is entitled Divertissement, which is just French for diversions, right? Yeah. And his idea is that essentially humans are wretched creatures when they aren't diverted. That is, if you just stay in your room and you have nothing to think about and nothing to do and at all, what you will think about is your miserable state, that you're a human, you'll die, and all the things that, of course, we all will eventually have to deal with. But for Pascal, he says something like, all you need is just something small, like a ball that you can do this to. And that will divert you enough from thinking about your wretched state. The idea being that I think, once again, the imagination is so powerful that though you reason it out that you have to die, your imagination is more powerful because it does end up letting you kind of not think about your wretched state as a human being. And I'm sure we've all felt that sort of boredom, that ennui, where you're just like, oh my goodness, you start going inward more or something.
Well, exactly.
And then it doesn't take much, like a little bird to watch, and you watch the bird fly around or something, and then suddenly you're like, oh, I feel okay now for that second. And I think Pascal even mentions this in his work, that this is why we like the chase, not the actual outcome. If you just go to the hunter and be like, here's your dead rabbit, that's no fun for the hunter. The hunter enjoyed the hunting, the chasing of the rabbit, because it diverted him from his wretched, miserable state, according to Pascal.
Would you say then Pascal more or less says we're more we're happier when we're not diversion grounds us? Does it ground us?
I think so. I think it does. And the question I always wondered was, for Pascal, with me, was, does it matter what your diversion is? And he doesn't really talk about that too much. So, you can interpret, why people like to be on Facebook nowadays, or why this. Well, it's just a way of diverting their attention away from their wretched state in life. And I'm not saying like this person's wretched, this person's not. According to Pascal, everybody is wretched once they start going inward, and they have nothing to divert their attention from. And so I at one point, maybe I was annoyed at all the clicking of cell phones in my life. And then after reading Pascal, I was like, well, what's the difference between clicking your cell phone so you're not thinking about your miserable state, or writing a poem or reading a philosophical text? For me, it kind of it humbled me a little bit to better appreciate what other people do for their diversions. Because you've heard, of course, like, why would somebody sit there and paint figurines all day or something like this? And it's like, well, I mean, that person has found a diversion. And maybe we can celebrate all diversions, at least if they're not harmful to others.
Right. And because what you're talking about now just reminds me that he's delving into psychology.
I forgot to bring that up, too.
Because a friend of mine is a therapist, and she says one way that she gets it's the children that she works with in particular grounded, because even children turn inward, is they sit on the floor with objects, or they have to find something you can touch, find something you can taste, find something, and suddenly they're not anxious, they're thinking about the little task, the diversion they have at hand.
Yeah, like, what do you mean? I just want to make sure I understand about grounded, being grounded.
Right. Well, when you're grounded, you're in touch with the reality outside of you. I guess what's that take? Existentialism. But, right. You're in touch. When you turn inward, you're not living in the real world. When you turn inward, you're living in the world of the mind, which definitely. I mean, philosophers. They spend all their time there. I mean, you know what it's like being a teacher there, and now and then you have to. Do something, watch a stupid watch a Three Stooges or something, just to get yourself out of that that depth of mind. I mean, when you wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and you're thinking, well, I'll be teaching, such and such today, and I need to make sure that I cover this aspect of it, or that my students clearly understand this, because you're.
I had a friend, a professor friend, tell me once that being a teacher or a professor is much like being an artist. That is, it's very inward. There's a lot of inwardness going on. Not only creating a class and creating the environment, creating assignments, and just being creative, but the fact that you spend a lot of time alone, sitting there looking at things, either correcting things, preparing for things, or whatever, that it's much like an artist.
Right, and you reflect on it too. Did I cover this? Should I take this in this direction? I notice that all the time, and I don't mean to scare anybody who's watching the show if they see me on the road, but sometimes I drive home from school and I don't remember the ride home.
Oh yeah, we've all done that.
In my head about what some lesson plans that I wanted to go over, and something I was usually very excited about.
Yeah.
It's usually very positive.
I think you've just kind of also reinforced what Pascal was saying, how much the imagination can take over, because you're driving, which is you got to be focused and kind of watch, but you're in that moment, but your imagination is thinking about, okay, did I cover this? Did I do that? Did I do this? And a couple minutes have gone by, or 20 minutes, or however long it takes to get home, and then you pull up in your driveway. We've all been there, and we're like, how did I get here?
Right.
How did that even happen? I think that's, like you said, I forgot to bring up, but I think you're right that it's quite a psychological analysis.
Right.
That he's bringing
and
in.
of course, psychology didn't exist as a separate discipline at that point, but it came out of philosophy.
Oh yeah,
out of observation.
Yeah,
which is what philosophy is.
A lot of things. If we think about it, it starts as philosophy because there are no answers, and then once somebody starts having a method, a more specific method that does offer at least some answers, not that it's the only answer, but some answers, it then becomes a science, right? Because we have a method to find certain answers, or at least certain findings.
Right.
Where philosophy
it applies to everything that it covers.
And philosophy is kind of like what you and I are doing. That is, we sit back and we chit-chat using reason or whatever method we want to use, because we're not searching for any specific answer. We're trying to find it in a way with our experiences, with what we've read and things like that. So I think this happened with sociology, psychology. I think we could probably, biology started as Aristotle, started with exploring and looking at animals and things like that. Almost all the sciences started as a philosophy. And I mean, even when you get your PhD, it's a doctorate of philosophy in biology, or a doctorate of philosophy in English, or a doctorate of philosophy in whatever it is. And so, I think philosophy is you could trace back any discipline to philosophy, or I think so, to Plato or Aristotle for the most part.
Well, many of them delve just not into the entertainment of thoughts, but thoughts as they applied to mathematical principles.
Oh, Euclid. What did Plato say? Before you can come into my academy, you must first be a mathematician, or something like that. I mean,
so those who were interested in geography, astronomy, they started to apply mathematical principles. It was I believe it was Isaac Newton that talked about math being the language of science.
And even Isaac Newton's great work, which is, I think, known normally as the Principia, right, is, if you continue with the title, it's something like the philosophical something of nature, right? And so there's still philosophy in there.
Right, it's not just a science book. Exactly.
No, it's not a science book. He's, that's a whole nother discussion, Newton, because he is... What gravity with that topic, huh?
Good one.
Sorry.
I saw it coming.
You saw it coming, yeah. I had to, But no, I do think that it's funny because we started talking about like the human nature with Pascal, and you brought up, and we've talked about a lot of things, that they're imaginative, but also that underneath it all, without our imagination, it seems like Pascal was saying we're quite wretched creatures. Part of it, because where does science take you? He claims that science takes you to an impersonal universe. It doesn't care what you do. It is an impersonal universe. And so that's something that also he talks about, which is... in the Pensée, it's a portion called the Disproportion of Man. It's a section in here. One of my favorite parts besides the section divertissement and the wager, as you have now explained it to me. And I find that quite fascinating too, because I always thought it was a 50-50 kind of wager, not a 66 and 33. I don't need to get specific there on the decimal points, but the disproportion of man you might find interesting actually, and then we're probably going to wrap this up a little bit. But the disproportion of man was something that was happening during the Enlightenment with Voltaire too. During one of his short stories, I think it was called Micromegos. Have you ever heard of this short story, Micromegos? So it was something that was an idea that was occurring to many infinitely large, right? And I think we think of ourselves, if we really want to like go inward and think, we are merely a speck on a speck in the universe, right? We're just this little tiny speck on the Earth, which is a speck once you get into not just your universe, the galaxy, supernovas. I mean, we become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Right?
Horton Hears a Who.
Horton Hears a Who, yeah, exactly. Or Carl Sagan, I think, says something like that too, right? That is, we are a speck on a speck, but Horton Hears a Who. I love it, yeah. So this is something that's, been around before Pascal and the Enlightenment, this idea that we are small in the universe. But what Pascal, and during this time, shows humans is not, we're in this weird middle state, because though we are a speck on a speck, we are also what he calls a colossus. That is, you go to a bug, and for him, he says, you look at a bug, and then you keep going deeper and deeper, like with a microscope or something, and you can see, and he says, you can see in there, you pull out, and it has veins, and it has blood vessels, and of course this is in 21st century science he's talking about, and you keep going in, and he essentially says you get to universes, microscopic universes, which later become something like quantum physics or something. And
taking the ideas of something even smaller.
Yes, so he says, I want to introduce you to a new abyss. Not the abyss of the largeness of life, but the abyss of the smallness of life, and that it's infinite both ways. Life is infinitely large out there, so we are a speck on a speck, but life is also infinitely small, so we're at the same time this giant. All right. If you think of an atom, we are a giant compared to an atom, but we are also a speck on a speck, right? And so for him, he says essentially, this is where science takes you. Rational thought will take you to this point where you are both a speck and a giant, and it's sort of contradicting in a way, right? But what he then says is we essentially, if because of this disproportion of our existence, we can know nothing that is too large, and we can know nothing that is too small. The only thing we can know as humans is what's right in the middle. And one of his examples that will bring this down to earth is if a sound is too loud, it'll blow our eardrums and we won't hear it. If a sound is too low, we just won't hear it.
At all. Yeah.
If a light is too bright, it'll blind us. If a light isn't bright enough, we can't see. And so there's only this sort of middle ground that we can actually have knowledge about. And I think that's part also of his argument against Descartes. Descartes thinks we can know a lot eventually.
So he says we're limited.
Very limited.
Yes. Do you think this is like an anti-humanist response?
It starts to sound like it a little bit, because he's claiming exactly what you're saying, that all you guys out there, especially Descartes, who think you can come to the foundation of knowledge or something like that, you haven't spent enough time thinking about your place in nature.
Well, that would also lead back to the religious aspect or the theological aspect or God existence too, because if God is the infinite, everything, and is everywhere and omnipotent, we're in that middle ground we can never perceive.
Exactly.
That's great.
And that's what he kind of says. Big. And that's why, of course, the imagination comes back, because we can use our imagination, but we couldn't really use reason to kind of figure that out. He says, I can't remember the exact quote, but something like God is a circle where its circumference is infinite or something like that, but its center point is everywhere. I think I have that actually wrong, but it's something of that nature where... I wish I knew it better, because he's a mathematician, so he has this beautiful sort of imaginative mathematical way of expressing it. Right. But I can't remember it exactly.
Because, there were a few philosophers after him for the Age of Enlightenment who were some of the biggest critics, and I think one would be de Holbach. And,
critics of Pascal?
I think he's a little bit later, but no, he was a criticism. He was critical of the Age of Enlightenment, and you always have that kind of person. when there's a big movement going on, they simply take another side, whether they deliberately feel that way or whether they're doing it for the sake of getting likes.
Rousseau, wasn't he a critic? Would you call Rousseau a critic of the Enlightenment?
But not like the Holbach just blew it all off, and basically by saying that, all the things you're setting out to prove you'll never be able to do because human beings simply are not capable of doing that. So you're just fooling yourselves, and you're creating a mass of nonsense that is just no more than a bundle of impressions.
Yeah, I wonder if that's where his sort of influence in existentialism comes too, because you get these sort of history of existentialism books, and many times it starts with Pascal as your first sort of existentialist, and I wonder if it's part of that, like, scientific thought leads you to this idea where there's an impersonal universe out there, and now you must have to figure out how you're going to live inside this impersonal universe. And you have to figure out that you are, like I said before, a speck on a speck, and yet a colossus.
Right.
There's a great disproportion. I think we've talked quite a bit about Pascal here today. We started with, of course, what is the nature of being human, according to Pascal. Just a review for a little bit. We said he's an imaginative creature, definitely. We said he thinks he's a wretched creature if he can't use his imagination to sort of divert himself.
He's a limited creature.
He's limited, he's a limited group. Good point. He's very limited. And, part of this, too, I think, is that he wants to humble. He wants to humble these philosophers.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
He wants to
and
bring
I always
them
get that about anything you read that he wrote. There's a certain humility and everything.
Yeah.
Even his life was very humble.
Yeah. As you were saying, kind of a simple life.
Yeah, his father was a civil servant in France. He did accounting for the government.
Yeah. And, there are advantages, I would say, personally, about being humble about what you know, because if you think you know something, then you're not asking questions and you're not learning.
Right.
As Socrates says, right? What makes me wise is I know that I don't know.
Right, and you don't expect people to challenge you if you believe, everything you know.
Yeah, and you're closed-minded. You're not open-minded about what you could possibly learn and things like this. So he's a wonderful person in the history of ideas to help remind us that we really should be humble about what we know. Yet we can enjoy, of course, discussing all these things, and through discussion we could then learn a little bit more.
Right.
Or at least open our minds a little bit to other perspectives and other ideas that are out there.
Right, mostly other perspectives. Take an idea that may be shared by a lot of people, but he puts it in such a perspective that it's just not what we expected.
Exactly. And that's why I always enjoy these conversations with you, because we both have a similar sort of desire to inquire into things, but we also have, we're willing to listen to each other and see what each other have to say.
Right.
And with that, I think maybe we can wrap this up. And so I want to thank you again for joining us for Two Teachers and a Table this week. Next week, we will be discussing Shakespeare. So please join us for a wonderful discussion about William Shakespeare.